Pity the Nation, Chapter 1. Sepia Pictures on a Wall. I think that tree roots cannot grow in ash. Stetik Wojciech, Guide at Auschwitz Concentration Camp, Warsaw, 16 December 1986. It was snowing in Letuska Street. Not big, heavy flakes, but small, hard, blinding droplets. Almost sleet that blessed the dull suburban road with a kind of gray fog. We parked our car on the pavement beside a tiny, bare tree, its branches glistening with rime. The few people in the street were hunched in their furs. Winter had attacked Poland more savagely than usual. When we climbed to the second floor of number 10 Letuska Street, it was so dark that we had difficulty in reading the name on the door of apartment 15. When we pressed the bell, we heard first the paws of a large dog on the other side and a muffled bark, followed by the sound of human feet shuffling on the floor. They seemed to take a long time reaching the door. It opened to reveal an old man, breathing heavily, his arms at his side, bent slightly but with the eyes of a teenager. Simon Datner's expression of permanent youth is an illusion, for it is the result of suffering. We introduced ourselves. I am the journalist who has come from Lebanon, I tell him. He does not smile. He remembered our telephone call. The dog, a large gray beast with heavy, kind eyes, jogged its paws on the ground in excitement as Simon Dartner led us into a small room with a tall bookcase against one wall, so crammed with volumes that pamphlets and books were squeezed into the shelves at odd angles, in danger of exploding outwards onto the floor. When he sat down, Simon Datner looked smaller and older in his brown zip-up jacket. He placed us at right angles to him at the wooden table and rested his clasped hands on the surface with careful formality. What can I do for you? He was like an archivist, a man of research, grown used to the naivety of undergraduates. I explained that I was writing a book about Lebanon, about the events that I had witnessed and reported in Lebanon for more than a decade, about why these events happened as they did. I said that I suspected some of the answers lay in the Holocaust, which is why I had come to Poland. Simon Datner nodded slowly. He was a survivor of the Holocaust, one of the few thousand Polish Jews to have escaped extermination, but to have stayed on in the country of their birth. He was a tiny, fragile link to the Israel which I was writing about. He was of the generation of Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. Begin was born in Brest, Litovsk, which was in Poland and is now in the Soviet Union. Shamir came from the village of Rushova in eastern Poland and went to school at the Hebrew Gymnasium in Bialystok. His gymnastics and music teacher in Bialystok was Simon Datner. I can remember a not tall boy, a very vivid one, smart. Datner spoke very slowly. Everything at the gymnasium was taught in Hebrew, except Polish and Polish history. I even taught gymnastics and music in Hebrew. That is the language in which he learned. Datner still felt the pride of being a schoolmaster. Our pupils were brought up in a spirit of love and esteem for Poland, and also of love for Israel. Some of my pupils immigrated to what was then Palestine. Every year, we teachers passed hundreds of pupils through our ranks. Simon Datner slowly rose from his chair and shuffled to the corridor, into a small, narrow room with on one side a bed covered by a checkered blanket. On the facing wall were affixed some faded sepia photographs. In one of them, a class of the late 20s. The young Jewish boys were sitting stiffly to attention. A boy in the back row was grinning. Another had turned his head at the moment the photograph was being taken. Perhaps Shamir is there, Datner remarked. We looked in vain for the familiar chubby face. Datner did not know how many of these children left for Palestine, how many stayed behind. Beneath the pictures was a series of smaller photographs. Each showed a group of school teachers sitting on rows of chairs. The first picture labeled 1926, the last 1938, so that by casting our eyes along the row, we could see the teachers growing older, the bright, sometimes humorous faces of the Bialystok Gymnasium staff moving inexorably towards the Holocaust. There was a rather portly man in the front row who may have been the headmaster, and a woman with high, aristocratic features and jet black hair in the second. In 10 years, the portly man grows larger. The woman becomes more beautiful. One tries to detect some change in their expression, some hint of concern in their dark eyes, as the cameraman takes what was to be their last photograph in 1938. There is none. Did any of these teachers survive the Holocaust? I ask. Simon Datner places his stubby finger on the left-hand side of the picture and moves it steadily to the right, past the pudgy teacher. I think, he says, his finger sliding past the beautiful woman. None of them. There is a pause. Except this one. He is pointing to the sharp, staring features of Simon Datner. There is one more photograph behind the old man's bed, a pale brown picture that must have been enlarged from an earlier torn print, because there is an uneven white line across the bottom. The picture shows a young woman, remarkably pretty, smiling, with dark hair, and two little girls. The woman is Simon Datner's wife, Sosana. The girls are his daughters, Miriam and Shalomit. He wanted to talk about them. When the Nazis came, I was an inmate with my family in the Bialystok ghetto. I joined the underground and went into the woods and became a member of a Jewish partisan group, which amalgamated later with Russian and Polish partisans. Half of our people fell in battle. The other half survived. Simon Datner waited for several seconds, perhaps because he knew the question I wanted to ask. What happened to Shoshana and Miriam and Shalomit? He still paused because he did not know the complete answer. I am not sure, he eventually replied, but it seems to me that they died in the annihilation of the Bialystok Jewish ghetto in 1943. They were hidden in the underground bunker in the home where we lived, but they were betrayed to the Nazis by somebody and were executed on the spot. So far as I know, I don't know the place where their remains are, but every night before I go to bed, I say the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, for them. Simon Datner returned to his study. He wanted to know about Lebanon, and I asked him what he felt about what had happened there, about those events in Lebanon that had involved Israel, about the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Datner's parents immigrated to Palestine before the Holocaust, although his mother died during the war. I went to see my father in Palestine in 1947, he said. I was very glad to see the place where some 100,000 Jews from all over the world had gone before the war. It was a safe haven for them, and I am sure that if it was not for the policy of the British Mandate power, which forbade the Jews to immigrate to Palestine then, maybe some hundreds of thousands, if not millions of the Jews from the countries of Europe occupied by the Nazis could have been saved. Israel is, in my opinion, the first and last line of defense of the Jewish people all over the world. I am of this opinion today. The old man's conviction forced his voice to rise. There was a question I had to ask him, and I told him that he might feel he did not want to talk about it. But how could Israel, the nation which, of all others, understood the horror of mass murder, have allowed the Palestinians of Sabra and Shatila camps in Beirut to have been murdered? The number of Palestinians killed, up to 2,000, bore no relation to the 6 million Jews who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. But in the camp of Shatila, on the day the massacre ended, my colleagues and I, with bodies lying in heaps around us, had asked that question many times. Simon Datner looked in front of him. He understood why I had asked this question. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with great care, his English flawless. As far as I know, the Jewish soldiers did not take a direct part in this slaughter. It was a slaughter of innocent people. This is always an abhorrence to Jews. I am not in a position to judge whose fault it was that these terrible crimes took place, but I am sure no Jewish hand was involved in this massacre. He stopped speaking for perhaps 10 seconds. There was a point to be made. Then he began speaking again. But also I know of another massacre, an abhorrent massacre of Jewish children in a place called Ma'alot, which was committed by one or two members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. As far as I know, more than 20 children fell as victims. Of course, such crimes cannot be justified, but only deplored and stigmatized. Because of who Simon Datner was, because of his personal tragedy because he was a witness to the unthinkable. It seemed impossible to tell him what we had experienced in our little world. That his excuses for Sabra and Shatila, for that is what it was for his, that his excuse for Sabra and Shatila, for that is what it was almost identical to the historical parallels employed by tens of thousands of Israelis at the time. The Israeli soldiers who knew what had happened, who had done nothing to prevent the slaughter that was going on a few hundred yards from them, also told us about Ma'alot as we questioned them in West Beirut on 18 September 1982. With just such conviction did they deplore the massacre. We had questioned them incredulously, realizing what was the truth, that they had known yet done nothing. But could one question the self-assurance of this gentle old man, whose wife and daughters, whose sisters and brothers and aunts, at least 30 relatives in all, he thought, had been murdered by the Nazis? Outside the window of Simon Datner's study, the snow had grown heavier, the flakes larger, the glass steaming on the inside as the temperature fell in Lutuska Street. It seems to me, he said, that the safest guarantee for the security of Jews in Israel would be understanding and friendship between the Israelis and their Arab neighbors. But for marriage, that is a result of love and esteem. There must be a precondition. It must be mutual love, not just a pious desire of the Jews and the Arabs. Simon Datner sat back in his chair. He would say no more about the Palestinians, about those people who also regard the land of Palestine, in which his parents sought safety as their home. Yet the sense of belonging which Jews and Arab Palestinians felt towards Palestine had curiously passed Simon Datner by. How many Jews remain in Poland, in this country of the Holocaust, to live among the ghosts of their own departed people? Between 4 and 7,000, he suggested bleakly. We don't know, for there is one sad fact that must be mentioned, that because they were so frightened by their experiences, many Jews who survived the Holocaust, a great part of them, have until now hidden their provenance. They are hiding behind their Polishness. And Simon Datner, he remarried after the war, and his wife, although Jewish, was a prominent member of the Polish Communist Party. Instead of immigrating to the new Israel, he stayed behind to write about the Holocaust, to publish books and booklets and newspaper articles about the annihilation of the Poles and Jews. He had grown weary, and his unnaturally young eyes looked tired. He is 84 years old. All this is at the root of why I remain to work here, he said, and now I am an old man, and I remain only to wait for the bitter end of everybody in this life to pass away. Auschwitz-Birkenau. The road to Auschwitz from Krakow was almost covered in snow. It runs through a succession of poor villages, and we had to slow often to allow the farmers to pass. Great men on wooden carts pulled by thick-necked, snorting horses. There were still wooden cottages beside the fields, long barn-like structures whose roofs sagged in the center as if they had too long borne oppression. Just once, for a few minutes, a pale pink sun emerged meanly through the gray snow clouds. About 7 miles north of Oswiecim, the traffic was backed up at a railway crossing. We climbed out of our car and stamped our boots in the snow as we waited for the train. It was a long time in coming, but we could hear it far away because of its wailing. Polish state railways use diesel locomotives for their main-line passenger services, but out of the forest to our left came a great steam locomotive, a black-painted Goliath of pipes and pistons with 2 big wind deflectors at the front, shoveling white smoke across the snowfields, pulling behind it a long line of freight cars. They clinked past us slowly, cattle wagons and flatbed trucks and a big guard's van moving softly off into the cold fog. The drivers watched them with disinterest, climbing into their cars with relief. By the time we reached the town of Oswiecim, the mist had begun to close in. Like many of the towns and cities of Eastern Europe and of Ireland, Oswiecim had two names, a legacy of conquest and colonization of shared or defeated cultures, Polish, Russian, or German, but this is a place which needs a pseudonym, for who would want to admit that they had made their home at Auschwitz? It is as if the Polish name was essential for any narrative plausibility. How could one otherwise say that the local railway station trains to Warsaw every 3 hours is bright and clean, refurbished with new bricks? Indeed, Auschwitz station has a new digital clock so that rush hour commuters to Krakow should not miss their connection. But should not miss their connection. There are sidings just down the line that run directly into the 45-year-old factories, the same still functioning factories built by the Germans for their slati, a labor for the I think that's a type I meant to say slave labor, still served by the same track and permanent way. Even Stequius Wojciech, the official Polish guide to the concentration camp, admits that he lives in a house built for the SS camp staff. Is this, in the end, part of the banality of evil? The very expression of Hannah Arendt, now almost a cliche amid the attempts to understand wickedness? It is perhaps excusable that the railway branch line just 1 mile Auschwitz-Birkenau. The road to Auschwitz from Krakow was almost covered in snow. It runs through a succession of poor villages, and we had to slow often to allow the farmers to pass. Great men on wooden carts pulled by snorting thick-necked snorting horses. There were still wooden cottages beside the fields, long barn-like structures whose roofs sagged in the center as if they had too long borne oppression. Just once, for a few minutes, a pale pink sun emerged meanly through the gray snow clouds. About 7 miles north of Oswiecim, the traffic was backed up at a railway crossing. We climbed out of our car and stamped our boots in the snow as we waited for the train. It was a long time in coming, but we could hear it far away because of its wailing. Polish state railways used diesel locomotives for their main line passenger services, but out of the forest to our left came a great steam locomotive, a black-painted Goliath of pipes and pistons, with two big wind deflectors at the front, shoveling white smoke across the snowfields, pulling behind it a long line of freight cars. They clicked past us slowly, cattle wagons and flatbed trucks, and a big guard's van, moving softly off into the cold fog. The drivers watched them with disinterest, climbing into their cars with relief. By the time we reached the town of Oswiecim, the mist had begun to close in. Like many of the towns and cities of Eastern Europe and of Ireland, Oswiecim has two names, a legacy of conquest and colonization, of shared or defeated cultures, Polish, Russian, or German. But this is a place which needs a pseudonym, for who would want to admit that they had made their home at Auschwitz? It is as if the Polish name was essential for any narrative plausibility. How could one otherwise say that the local railway station trains to Warsaw every 3 hours is bright and clean, refurbished with new bricks? Indeed, Auschwitz station has a new digital clock so that rush hour commuters to Krakow should not miss their connection. There are sidings just down the line that run directly into the 45-year-old factories, the same still functioning factories built by the Germans for their slati a labor, which still served by the same track and permanent way. Even Stequius Wojciech, the official Polish guide to the concentration camp, admits that he lives in a house built for the SS camp staff. In this, in the end, part of the banality of evil, the very expression of Hannah Arendt, now almost a cliche amid the attempts to understand wickedness. Is it perhaps excusable that the railway branch line, just 1 mile out of Auschwitz station, the most terrible permanent way in the world, somehow exerts a more subtle, more acute fascination than all the evidence of butchery and madness within the camp? For the very same track which carried the millions to the gas chambers is still there, curving gently past the back of some farm cottages, across the laneway, through a field, to the neat brick and slate gateway of Birkenau. in 100 photographs on the covers of innumerable works of Holocaust literature. That geometrical porch has become somehow familiar, a geographical reassurance in a strange land that one comes across as one might suddenly recognize the Great Wall or the Forbidden City, even if one had never before been to China. We had seen it in the pictures. There's the Great Wall. Ah, yes, this must be Birkenau. And I climbed from the car and I walked to the railway line. There were the rails, the iron ties still clenched around them, securing them to the old wooden sleepers. You could run a train into the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp today without any danger of derailment, right up to the selection ramp. It was so cold that my camera lens frosted, but I took 2 pictures of the Birkenau gateway, one from the ground level where the snow lay smooth on top of the tracks. Inside, the points were still set for the left-hand siding, as if someone had diligently prepared for just one more transport to arrive. I think I supposed that later, from the photographs, some truth might emerge that would help to encompass the enormity of what had happened here. 4 days earlier, I had been in Beirut, driving past the Saba and Shatila Palestinian camps to the airport, because I suspected that in Poland, at Auschwitz, lay clues to what I had seen in Lebanon. Yet from the hot, untidy killings of the Middle East to this frozen, methodical place was a journey that should have been taken in a spaceship across light years. No massacre in Lebanon could remotely compare with this in size, in scientific evil. The scale of the Holocaust here, of gypsies and Polish non-Jews as well as Jews, was so unimaginable that the tens of thousands of deaths in Lebanon seemed somehow an irrelevance. This, of course, is not what history is to teach us, nor is it true. But if that is how I, a stranger, a non-Jew, born a year after Hitler's death, could think, even briefly, then how is one even to question the survivors or their children? Or, more importantly, how is one to approach the behavior of the state, which was forged, as many of its citizens will tell you, in the very fires of Auschwitz? Every Jewish victim of the Holocaust, as it says at the Yad Vashem Memorial outside Jerusalem, was made an honorary citizen of Israel. If this premise is accepted, then to visit Auschwitz is not only a pilgrimage to the largest mass grave in the world, but an acknowledgement of its intimate connection to the Middle East, and, ultimately, to the tragedy of inconsequential significance, if the equation is to be resolved only with numbers, of another people, indeed of numerous peoples whose own suffering I and my colleagues in Lebanon had witnessed. Yet here, even the literature of the Holocaust can prove almost as shocking as the actual experience of violence in the Middle East. The night before we traveled to Auschwitz, I had lain in bed in the Hotel Polski in Krakow, listening to the snow shawling its way across the window and reading one of Tadeusz Borowski's short stories of the Birkenau camp, the one called This Wave for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. After surviving both Auschwitz and Dachau, Borowski gassed himself in 1951, and the book reads as though it had been written by a man who was already partly dead. The prose is stretched to the very limit of meaning, the sense more important than the grammar. The direct speech is ugly. There are whole sentences without verbs. Borowski wrote that the living are always right, the dead are always wrong. But in the preface, his editor disagrees. What Borowski wrote about Auschwitz, he says, proves that it is the dead who are always right. Borowski identifies himself with a camp capo, one of the prisoners who waits for the railway transports to arrive with Jews from Hungary, Holland, France, and Germany itself. This is the quotation. Slowly, terribly slowly, a train rolls in. The engine whistles back with a deafening shriek. Again wary, pale faces at the windows, flat as though cut out of paper, with huge, feverishly burning eyes. Already trucks are pulling up. Already the composed gentleman with the notebook is at his post, and the SS men emerge from the commissary carrying briefcases for the gold and money, we unseal the train doors. It is impossible to control oneself any longer. Brutally, we tear suitcases from their hands, impatiently pull off their coats. Go, go on, vanish. Men, women, children. Some of them know. The victims are Hungarian Jews who arrived at Auschwitz in 1944 to be murdered, all 400,000 of them in just 2 months, consumed by the gas chambers at a rate of 24,000 a day, even though the crematoria could not cope. They are dragging to the truck an old man wearing tails and a band around his arm. His head knocks against the gravel and pavement. He moans and wails in an uninterrupted monotone. Ik wil met dem Herrn Kommandanten spreken. I wish to speak with the commandant. Several other men are carrying a small girl with only one leg. Tears are running down her face, and she whispers faintly, "Sir, it hurts. It hurts." They throw her on the truck on top of the corpses. She will burn alive along with them. Should one therefore regard Auschwitz as a place to understand evil, or as a shrine to the dead and all their sufferings, or merely as a measure of distance between the experience of those who survived Auschwitz and those who can never comprehend what that meant? In Warsaw, we had met an Associated Press correspondent who had traveled to Auschwitz with a Jewish delegation for a memorial service. 2 of them were on the ramp where the selections were made for the gas chambers, he had told us. There was this man and woman, and they stood there arguing about where Mengele, the camp doctor who did the medical experience, had stood. The guy said Mengele stood on one side, and this woman was swearing it was on the other side of the ramp, and she was crying. There were all these TV cameras recording this poor woman having a nervous breakdown right there, arguing about where Mengele stood. Can you imagine it? His question unwittingly struck at the problem which faces all newcomers to this place. It is not that what occurred here passes comprehension, which it does, but that it is distant even from imagination, which is perhaps why the writings of Primo Levi conveys more reality to us than the artifacts of Auschwitz. The actual terrifying evidence that yes, it all happened just as we have always been told. So the surviving gas chamber in the original Auschwitz camp, the crematorium with the name of its Erfurt manufacturers, still displayed on the oven, the roomfuls of human hair, the medical experiment block, the piles of spectacles, the Birkenau railhead, the execution wall, the mass gallows, all serve to authenticate the accounts of Borowski or Levi rather than as evidence in their own right, because evidence can only be applied to imaginable things. Only the empty tins of Zyklon B crystals, their lids ripped off as if they were cans of beans emptied by an impatient cook, were somehow different. The jagged edges of the metal lids demonstrated the impatience of the German who had poured the contents into the gas chambers. Let's get this business over quickly, he must have been saying. These rusty little horrors were part of a routine, and thus imagination could just encompass them. But other things in the Auschwitz showcases led nowhere. In one room, in the old camp buildings, there were piles of suitcases, most of them bearing the names of their owners. These were a few of the same suitcases that Borowski's camp capo and his colleagues so brutally tore from the hands of the Jews in the Birkenau railway sidings. There was nothing unreal about this luggage. The names had been crayoned onto the bags in a hurry by people who had been given little time to leave their homes and ghettos. One cracked brown suitcase bore a name in childish handwriting, the letters of unequal height. Karl Israel Hafner. It said, Vienna 1, Biberstrasse 14. I wrote down the name and address. Was he, as his handwriting indicated, a small boy, perhaps of school age? Could he, by some miracle, have lived through Auschwitz, perhaps even returning to his old home? What happened to his father and mother, or his brothers and sisters? Did any of his family survive the Holocaust? On my way back to Beirut, I routed my flight through Vienna, and I took a taxi into the city. It was almost as cold as Poland, and Biberstrasse was deep in snow. It was a narrow, respectable street with double-glazed windows to keep out the cold. A thoroughfare might have seen better days, for number 14 was no longer an apartment. Bundesministerium Ministerium Furland and Forwurstkraft, it said over the main door of the building. Though, which it said over the main door of the building, though which, more than 45 years earlier, Karl Hefner must have walked for the last time, clutching his ungainly suitcase. The apartment block was now part of the Austrian Ministry of Agriculture. Its interior had been torn out and replaced by offices. Just down the road, the girl in the local post office could not understand my inquiry. There was no way, she said, that her bureau could trace a resident so long absent from their neighborhood. Even the local rabbi, for Bibelstraus is still in what is left of the Jewish area of Vienna, had no record of the name. Karl Israel Hafner had simply disappeared. His family, his identity, his very existence had vanished. It was as if the Hafners had never lived, which is what Hitler intended. Only that ancient suitcase with its childish writing shows where Karl Hafner disappeared to. Wojciech, our Auschwitz guide, understood something of this, perhaps because he had met so many survivors, perhaps because, living with his wife and young son in the old SS house, the evidence of Auschwitz had itself become common. Yet, he had other knowledge that provided its own chilling evidence of the realities of Auschwitz. Some weeks ago, we had a West German delegation here, he said. They wanted to lay wreaths on the execution wall where the Nazis shot thousands of people, whole families together, the mother and father holding the hands of their children who stood between them as they were killed. Well, we always have to clear the wreaths away after a while when they die. On this occasion, my colleagues went to clear the stuff away, and when they took one dead wreath from the wall, they found hidden on the back of it a very small plastic swastika. Why would anyone do that? If further evidence of the darkness of the mind were needed, one has only to notice the camp guards. Yes, there are camp guards. There are camp guards at Birkenau camp now, dressed in black, officially appointed by the Polish government to protect Auschwitz. Wojciech explained in an almost matter-of-fact way, "You see, we believe that nothing should be taken from here, but people come here with metal detectors to look for things." He did not want to continue, for there was clearly something very shaming in what he knew. We pressed him. "What could anyone be looking for with metal detectors at night?" he said. "They have come here at night, and they go up to where the ash pits are, where the Nazis put the ash of all the dead, and they look for things. They've been told that some of the men and women, just before they went into the gas chamber, realized what was happening, that they had jewels and things that they buried them rather than let them fall into the hands of the Nazis. So the people with metal detectors were coming here at night to look for jewels. That is why we have the guards." Visitors to Auschwitz camp are not normally taken to the ash pits. It was a long drive down an unpaved road thick with ice, a track marked by a row of watchtowers with neat slate roofs and the posts for the barbed wire of an uncompleted Birkenau compound. The Germans were still enlarging Auschwitz when the Red Army arrived to liberate it. Through a rustling gate, we walked into a little forest between rows of tall fir trees. The snow was encrusted onto their bark, for there had been a blizzard in the night, but from time to time in the silence cakes of snow would slide off the upper branches and start a small ghostly landslide deep inside the foliage. To our right were some stumps of masonry almost obscured by the snow, the remains of one of the 4 Birkenau gas chambers, destroyed by the camp guards in the last days. And further over, beside the forest wall, was a deep ditch, a trench that cut a 90-degree angle beside a wall of fir trees, where another of those clean, well-built watchtowers nestled amid the branches. This was one of the burning ditches, in which the Germans used when the crematoria could no longer cope with the 24,000 corpses a day. The bodies were burned in pyramids, on trestles above the trenches. The remains were thrown with all the other ashes into the small natural lakes beside the clearing. Wojciech stood there in the snow, saying nothing. A museum curator beside the buried ashes of nearly 4 million people, most of them were Jews, From above the trees, from far away on the other side of Auschwitz, came the long wail of a steam locomotive. Perhaps it was the same train we had seen in the morning, now taking its empty freight cars back to Krakow or Warsaw. Its whistle turned into a high shriek that varied in pitch and then became smothered by the fog. The forest was silent. Wojciech said that he had never seen or heard birds here, nor were there any trees at the shore of the little lakes. I think that tree roots cannot grow in ash, Wojciech said. But they were not but they were really not even lakes, just small frozen ponds with a fringe of undergrowth covered in hoarfrost. If this had been anywhere else, we would have noted the fragile beauty of the place. In any other land, someone would have built a wooden pier into the pond for fishermen or tethered a small boat to the shore. But in another country, if its contents were known, there would have at least been a sign. The last mortal remains of even 30 humans would warrant a stone. The resting place of 300 would need an artist of world renown to design the memorial. And memorials there are indeed at Birkenau between the two railhead gas chambers. But here, at this ash pit, there was nothing. If the grave of 300 might be commemorated, how can one represent in words the ashes of 3,000 or 30,000, or, let us be realistic about this little pond, of 300,000? Somewhere down there, in the cold depths beneath the ice, were the powdered white bones of cities, of people, of generations, of a whole continent. At one edge of the pond, the frosted weeds had been scuffed, and from the shore a set of small animal tracks led over the ice, probably a fox, taking a short cut across the clearing. But near the center of the surface, crust had suddenly been punctured by the animal's paw. The fox had obviously run to the bushes in panic, for his tracks had slithered and scraped their way back across the ice. I took several monochrome photographs of this little lake, with its frosted surface and backdrop of sagging white trees. When I returned to Beirut, I had the pictures developed, but there must have been something wrong with the chemicals used to print the photographs. Perhaps they had been diluted before being sold, for after 4 or 5 weeks, the pictures of Auschwitz, of the Birkenau railhead, the gas chambers, and the ash pits became grainy and less distinct, and developed a dark sepia tint like old wartime photographs, the same color as the snapshots of the doomed Jews on old Shimon Datner's bedroom wall.